We're going to go to a more difficult example. Here we have a shot of a girl raising her hands in a field of wheat or dried grass. For this example, we don't need to do much of a primary correction. I kind of like the overall color, but there is one primary correction we're going to do, which is bring down the brightness a little bit. Basically, in this shot, let's say the director tells you that, he doesn't want such a bright, blown out sky, even though it's shot this way. This was basically shot on an overcast day, but he wanted some texture in this sky region. So how do we do that? Well, for this, we're going to go to the secondary correction. Now, I brought down the brightness a little bit because I looked at my white clouds over here. If I turn that correction off, you can see that it's very close to being blown out. So that is the reason why I brought down the brightness. But in doing so, it darkens up the whole image. And that's fine because now we're going to be doing the secondary correction. Now, the secondary correction section has three parts to it. There's a show mask feature. There's the high, mids, and shadows area. And then there's the masks. Let me explain to you what these features do. Show mask shows you the different ranges of the luma that the plugin is picking up. It does this by showing you literally a mask. The red area is where it's picking up the highlights. The mid-tones is this area right here. And the shadows are here. Now the shadows are a little hard to see sometimes because it's putting it over a black image. To better illustrate how this works, I'm going to go back to the gray ramp example here. I'm going to reset this ramp and I'm going to go straight to my secondary correction. We notice under the highs, mids, and shadows, when we bring down that triangle, that there is something called luminance range. These are the controls that essentially affect the highlights, midtones, and shadows mask. One great thing about ColorFast, which makes it absolutely unique as a color grading tool, is that it lets you choose what you want to be in the highlights, midtones, and shadows. Now, this saves a lot of work because in other color grading applications, sometimes you think that something is in the highlights and you try to move the color wheels and it turns out that it wasn't really in the highlights, it was part of the midtones. And mistakes like that don't really happen in ColorFast because you know exactly what part of the image you're affecting. For instance, with the highlights, we can see that it's the highlights of this gray ramp, the midtones is the middle, and the shadows is the low part. In the highlights, we can control how much highlight we want to cover by moving this highlight threshold. So as you can see, if I bring it down, more of that highlight is being covered, right? Now, because I have more of it covered, if I switch to midtones, it affects how much midtones are being covered. Similarly, shadows can also be concerned. If I increase the shadow threshold, more of this shadow area will be covered. Now, because we have a really large highlight and a very large shadows, our midtone areas is relatively very thin. Blend and spread determine how this mask behaves on top of the uncorrected image. So for instance, this mask is going to have whatever color correction you're going to do, whatever secondary correction you're going to do. Blend determines the opacity of the mask on the background. So for instance, if I have a zero blend, let me just look at, I'm going to go back to the highlights here. If I have a zero blend, you see that it's a very, very opaque mask, which means your correction will be very, very opaque. You also notice that there is a blurry edge here. That is determined by the spread parameter. The spread essentially is a blur parameter which blurs out the mask. In practical purposes, what that means for us is that it softens the edges. So at zero spread, the edge is very hard. Now I can use a combination of the blend and the spread to get the kind of effect that I want. Going back to our example, if we are to make the sky appear blue, we have to highlight that mask and specify that mask. So we're going to go to the highlights mask, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up the, I'm going to bring down the threshold so it's very, very opaque, and I'm also going to bring down the spreads. Now if you bring down the spread too much, you get to see all these hard lines in the highlight. So I'm going to bring it up a little bit more, actually the spread a little bit more. That actually looks good to me. For the midtones, most of the image is in the midtones, no surprise there. We're going to go to the shadows. Oh, actually I want more shadows. I want more of this field of wheat in the back to be in the shadows and more of her hair. So I'm going to bring up the shadow threshold. As you can see, more of these parts of the image is in the shadows. Now that we've defined what areas we want it to be in the highlights, mids, and shadows, we can turn the mask off and go straight to our corrections. Now, probably one of the first things you notice about ColorFast, especially if you've come from a different color grading tool, is that there are no color wheels. Now, let me explain to you why NewBlue Effects did this. Color wheels actually come from a controlled surface paradigm. Colorists have different balls representing the different ranges, and basically they roll the ball towards one color to increase that color, but it also subtracts the color on the opposite side of the color wheel. That is not really the most intuitive way of working if you don't understand how the mechanics of how that goes. Rather, what NewBlue Effects did was they came up with a way, what I call the what you see is what you get way of coloring, which is you basically choose the color that you want to affect, whether you want to increase that color or decrease that color. Also, this interface is much more intuitive for people who correct by the mouse and touchpad, which is most colorists today. Keeping that in mind, let's say that our highlights, which is this area, I want to pick blue. So I'm going to click in this area and I'm going to pick this dark bluish color and I'm going to crank it up to 100%, and notice already what it's doing is that it added a blue tint to the sky. The saturation, of course, determines how much color you want in that mask, and the level is essentially the luma component. I want to bring down the clouds a little bit so we see the sky a little bit more. So I darkened it a little bit and I added the tint, and now we see that we have a much bluer sky. It's also revealing some details of clouds over here. So that's good. That's exactly what we wanted. The bit tones obviously are a little bit underexposed right now, so I'm just going to bring up the levels. There you go. I'm also going to increase the saturation. So that looks good to me. And the shadows, I'm going to leave it the way it was, but I am going to actually increase the saturation so we get a little bit more color on our face. And I think this is close to being done. So I'm going to turn it off and turn it on. And now we see that we have a problem here. If you look carefully down here, you'll see that some of the highlights in the dried grass over here is being clipped off. The reason for this is that in the highlight mask, the mask picked up the brightest highlights in the grass. As you can see, there's some red over here. And because I underexposed the sky, it's darkening those highlights in the grass. Now, I don't want that to happen. So to take that correction out, we have a mask submenu. The mask submenu has two options. It has the skin preservation or color mask, and it has the shape mask. We're going to be looking at the shape mask for this example. So I closed my waveform so we can have a larger view of the screen here. Basically, the way the shape mask works is that you can see the shape mask in the show mask feature, and this is a temporary mask, which the reason why we don't see this mask in effect is because the enable is off. By default, this is the mask that it shows. Anything that is a negative, this middle part of the image, are the regions that are enclosed by the mask, and basically this is the region that will be included in the secondary correction. Anything outside this mask, in other words, the positive areas of this image, will be neglected by the secondary correction. Now, it's very round right now because by default the curvature is set to 100. I'm going to bring it down to 0. And I also have a feather control. I'm going to feather it out. Now, I know that I want to affect only the top part of the image, and I want the secondary correction off the grass. So to control the corner pins of that mask, you click on the name of the plugin and you simply move these target points. There you go. I want something like this. So I'm localizing only the top half for the secondary correction. Now if I turn my shape mask off, I can see what happened here. By the way, nothing seems to have happened here. That's because I haven't clicked on the enable switch. There you go. Now you can see that the grass is properly exposed. We see the highlights here. Nothing is lost in the highlights. And just to give you an example, this is how it looks uncorrected. This is how it looks corrected.